apologies everyone for the time we've taken. It's just a few tech glitches that we needed to sort out. My co-author is in Harare now and linked into this conversation. I'll open up for her to introduce herself. But for now, thank you so much for making time to come here. Thank you to Emilio, thanks to Emilio for organizing this and for Mike to help us sort out our tech issues. So this is a project that I have been collaborating with Zinzile Moyo who has extensive experience in working in extractivism. I also have worked in the region from a feminist women's rights perspective of environmental damage in relation to extractivism, but also done field work on this. And it was my first time. I've done some work in conveying some spaces in debating and discussing Zimbabwe and the crisis in Zimbabwe. But this was a first opportunity to go in depth and work with someone who has such extensive experience. Currently, I'm at the Institute for Environmental Futures, where I'm a policy interface fellow, and my name is Hibist Kassa. Zinzile, if you'd like to introduce yourself, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Hib. Hello, everyone. My name is Zinzile Fengu, and I am a PhD candidate at the Women's University of Africa here in Zimbabwe. I have extensive work experience within the feminist circles, and we in the field of feminism within the extractive sector. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this platform. Thank you.
Thank you, too. So, organized abandonment. Organized abandonment as a theory that would extended to apply to the case of Zimbabwe comes from the work of Hibist Kassa and Gilmore, who theorizes on the carceral state in the context of racial capitalism, looking at not just the United States, but has a global kind of perspective and lens or canvas within which we locate our work, within the specificities of the Zimbabwe context. And we're looking at the gendered impacts of extractivism by highlighting an aspect of analyzing the processes through which inequalities are reproduced in the context of Zimbabwe, but we also historicize it. And so in this presentation, so this is basically the outline that we'll be going through together to introduce not just this particular paper, which is a chapter as part of a book project that was conceptualized and implemented, really a book project, but basically looking at the Global South that's conceptualized and led by Carl Yipping, who's executive committee member of Development Alternatives with Women in a New Era. So it's a book project that has been ongoing and developed around gathering empirical evidence across the Global South, trying to understand and grapple with China's impacts in terms of its investments and the new global China that's in evolution. And so I'm thinking of ways in which we can engage critically with that and to be able to contribute to reshaping, if you will, an accountability mechanism around its impacts, but also to make sense of the different ways they may be mutual beneficial relations. And so within that, as I said earlier, we draw on the theoretical work of Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore in Abolition Geographies. We will discuss the methodology that Zinzile will lead us through, and also looking at the Zimbabwe context and the various reforms, crises, and economic context within a context of economic decline, sanctions that most of you will be familiar with, and then also have a sense of Bikita, which is in itself a microcosm of the crisis that's within Zimbabwe and itself more broadly Africa and the Global South, questions about indigenization that emerge strongly. And within this whole complex context, we find the women of Bikita, and we consider and reflect on what they're saying, what their experiences are, and that then shapes the conclusions and findings of this text. So as I said earlier, I really wish that you weren't seeing a lot of that unnecessary stuff, but so that you can see the image more. But this is Dawn and Phones in the back. Dawn Informs is a newsletter of development alternatives in women in a new era. So if you want to have a sense of all the different case studies that are across the global south, Latin America, the Pacific, you would have a sense in the Caribbean, you would have a sense of that by looking at the newsletter. So that's at the website dawnfeminist.org. So, sorry. So, the attempt of the book project is really to help us to guide a conversation in which we break away from a narrow framing of China, to begin to think about what China does and the impact it has, away from a state-led kind of top-down process, but begin to think through the processes that are occurring from a bottom-up lens. And as I said earlier, it's also about holding states and corporates to account, both global north and global south. So as a new actor, the question is, how does China differ in relation to the context where you've had traditional investors or donors, or in this case, extractivist projects that have been ongoing since the 1910 in Bikita, and try and understand how we locate China's impact, how we can understand the ways in which it's also being received, and the ways in which people are responding to it in different ways. So we deploy a class analysis also, so a gender class analysis in this sense, when we see the lens of the women in Bikita. And therefore, this then guides a Southern feminist analysis, a social movement perspective on how we're able to strengthen women's rights and gender equality and begin to achieve the social and environmental justice that ostensibly is supposed to be a priority. So first, what is extractivism? And the perspective we take is centrally, it's about an uneven integration in a global system of production, a global system of social reproduction, and also a global system of trade that is uneven in terms of the way it extracts labor, but also uneven in terms of the ways in which the environmental and social costs are borne by host countries. And so you have a situation where the host countries appear to be largely under-resourced in terms of their institutions to be able to hold corporates to account, and in terms of also the context of a low-wage labor regime that's very much central, especially in Southern Africa. It's the product of a system that deliberately depressed wages as part of the surveillance system of racial capitalism and its evolution historically, but also embedded within that is unpaid care work. So in this context, where you have new sources of investment, they're perceived as opportunities. We also see this as an opportunity, as a way to strengthen regulatory mechanisms, is the possibility at least, and to be able to have more expansive understanding of what could be what could be mutually beneficial. And therefore, the environmental and social governance response, we'd like to say and affirm that what we seem to be, and what's often crafted as Western investments being more sophisticated and more human rights centered in their approaches. The environmental and sustainability governance frameworks that exist are in themselves a product of protests, that are in themselves responses to demands for free, prior, and informed consent. They are in themselves responses to also demands for human rights recognition and reforms that are ongoing in international law to this moment. So within this framework, though, there are certain assumptions that prevail. So an assumption, for instance, being that corporates are duty bearers, that we'd be able to work with domestic courts and international courts to hold them to account for violations as and when they occur. Now, what we'd like to problematize or to consider is the way in which this assumption, which is reinforced by the United Nations Guiding Principles for Human Rights, and it's also adopted within the China Chamber of Commerce and Metals, Minerals, and Chemicals, importers and exporters kind of framework. So that is a corporate-led process within China. And then you have also the China's own due diligence guidelines. They also take up these frameworks. They also absorb this kind of approach. So it's a voluntary kind of process. It's all about self-regulation, which the UN has been very firm in advancing within the UN Global Compact, and a range of processes that have been ongoing that can be attributed to reforms that Kofi Annan unleashed within the UN system. And the idea that it's possible for corporates to achieve a balance, strike a balance between what should be the provision of public goods and in terms of achieving a social license and in terms of their impact. So to be able to kind of hold back the shareholders' interest and weigh that against their ability to make their corporate activities more sustainable, so to speak, that they'll be able to avoid disruptions or threats in the name of the greater public good and the greater interests of their shareholders, which is a contradictory kind of position to be placed in, but the assumption is it's possible. So therefore, even working within that assumption, what it does is it creates kind of a policy vacuum, because the assumption is that the corporates will be able to self-regulate broadly. And in practice, it's in the instances where community organizations are present, where journalists are able to access areas, and where NGOs are present, that you have documentation of violations as they occur, and they are taken through domestic courts. So it's a lot of resources at play that ordinary people who have been largely excluded from the benefits of these systems would, in rural areas also, would not necessarily be able to leverage. So it means that there are some people who are able to assert rights to a certain extent, and others who are not able to, and exist outside of that. So it's kind of creating a situation of a suspension of human rights for some, while others are able to exert it. And this is a question that Zinzile have been grappling with in the context of Zimbabwe. And we've seen across the global south, especially in the African region. And we are therefore asking questions and interrogating this, whether the progressive human rights approach that largely draws on international law and seeks to kind of leverage domestic and international courts, whether this system that relies on evidence that happens to be gathered where as and where there's a presence of these actors, civil society actors, whether this is sufficient. And also, what does it mean in terms of having your human rights suspended as a person? What it means within that kind of, as citizens, like, are these people even citizens in the countries that they occupy? And so these are not new questions anyway, but what we argue is that this creates a governance vacuum. And this is part of the post-colonial condition also. So it's not just a kind of a sense of just an institutional kind of, it's a historical process that has created this, that has also kind of created a state that's also, if you will, through the neoliberal governance kind of frameworks that have been introduced, amplified these tensions further. So what it does also in terms of the governance vacuum is that it has an implication in terms of the burden of social reproductive work that one face, but also the instances of gender-based violence increase. So the idea being that while the burden of social reproduction increases, the importance of women's labor is also amplified, and so is the term to use violence to be able to regulate that, to be able to access their bodies, to have control over women. And it's the bodily autonomy and integrity that comes out strongly in terms of the violations that people experience and the way that securitization is enforced. So for this reason that we draw upon Ruth Wilson Gilmore's theorization about abolition geographies, broadly that's the title of her book, but the theory that we pick out that we think is relevant in the context of Zimbabwe is organized abandonment, as you said, having the paper and all that. So organized abandonment in this sense is a theory of the way in which the state frames its securitization, not just in terms of its absence, but how it is present. So this is important also because the way Gilmore sees the state is not just an isolation of the theory of the state, but also the nature of the relation between the state and other actors. So that being corporates, that being political parties. So it's also a theory, it's also a class analysis of the ruling elites and the ways in which they wield the state, to the way in which they are able to make it amenable to their interests. And this is important to then consider in the case of Zimbabwe, which we will do. But I just want to emphasize on another aspect of organized abandonment is the intentional disinvestment. Again, she theorizes this in the context of the United States, But the disinvestment that is inherent in the neoliberal project is also not something that's peculiar to the US. It's across the board. And how this then impacts on, particularly when you think about social infrastructure, when you think about people's rights to water, access to even transport, public transport in itself, and the implications that it has on women, which we will see concretely in terms of their day-to-day lives. We include in this then the implications of also a corporate accountability kind of framework that's voluntary, as I said earlier, and the nature of the state, which is neoliberal, and the securitization that it enforces. So just to give everyone a sense of, you're all on the same page, Zimbabwe is in the southeast part of Africa, and Bikita itself is in the south of Zimbabwe. Bikita is important. It's located, and important like every other place, but it's located in a part of Zimbabwe in Masvingo province. And this is where you can find the great Zimbabwe, if you will, archaeological site, where you have a very sophisticated system of essentially how the elites lived in the past, the kind of society that existed, but also the economy. So the ways in which that people were able to build indigenous kind of setup, if you will, where there was also trade and exchange between Southern Africa reaching all the way to Asia. Trade in gold, in spices, movement of people, of course, ideas, but also to be able to understand the ways in which they stored water. So there's new research using remote sensing, that is technology, to be able to analyze the ways in which people were storing water within the Great Zimbabwe area. But it's also to be able to understand the ways in which that there was pillaging of the site. So as historic and important as it was, there was an initial denial of the fact that the people living in the area were the generations linked to the people who actually built the streets. There was an assumption that it had to be the Solomonic dynasty, it had to be somehow Arab or European. Within the hierarchy of racial capitalism, it wasn't possible that people living in that area who were Black could actually construct this for themselves. So that's important to understand, but also the pillaging that happened over the centuries. And this is an important period because that's also during the scramble of Africa, the processes that led up to that process, and the land dispossession that occurs, but also resistance. So here you have pictures of the Zion, women in the Zion Church of Bikita gathering together, but it was also a period, religion was very much linked with resistance about African nationalism, and at the time referred to as classical Ethiopianism. And so this was what I'm just trying to show you is that they have never been passive in relation to the way they've engaged with colonization and racial capitalism within a system of repression, but also to be able to understand the ways that it was embedded in the extractivist system that was emerged. And therefore, this is the context within which post-independent Zimbabwe, going through its liberalization phase and also facing resistance from students, from workers in the country. And then a crisis emerges after the veterans from the liberation struggle begin seizing land. And to be able to deal with the extreme inequality of land ownership in Zimbabwe. And within that context, the ruling elites are faced with a problem that they respond to. And this then shapes the context within which there's now political space for Zimbabwe to pursue indigenization policies in relation to the natural resources. But scholars who've investigated this have analyzed that it's not just a question of responding to external issues, there's also an internal problem, which are class gap between the ruling elite with the Black bourgeoisie, if you will, within Zimbabwe and those who till the land. The gap between them and in relation to the state. So what we see as a state, as acting or not acting, absences and presences in itself is not an expression of the interests of the whole of the people, but of the Black bourgeoisie. So this growing gap between them then impacts on the nature of the state. And this draws also on the work of Mahmoud Mamdani, which is very much established and important to be able to understand the kind of distorted way the state governs in rural areas in particular. So all of this, we argue, then shapes also or intermingles with the patriarchal domination that's also centered on controlling women's bodies, women's labor. So the fast-track land reform. Expropriation initiated by the veterans, as we said earlier, prolonged economic crisis, political upheaval. 2017, Robert Mugabe, the longtime ruler from independence, is overthrown in a coup. And you have Emerson Mnangagwa coming from the very same political party, the ZANU-PF. Nothing actually fundamentally changes in the way they rule, but significant concessions are made, particularly to compensate white farmers. And as this is being implemented, so is Zimbabwe also going through not just fast-track land reforms, but also reforms to the mining sector and thinking about getting a greater share of the value of mining and to be able to have that, to begin to, if you will, implement something that ensures that a fairer share of it being distributed, but fair in terms of who. So in real terms, when they try to integrate, if you will, community into the process, it's through community share ownership trusts, but these are not financed. And so in real terms, it doesn't act, it's more of a symbolic act, does not actually ensure inclusion of mine host communities. Their ability to even control these things are also limited legally, even if it were financed. So they're limited reforms, if you will. And through all this crisis and tumult, a consistent partner has been China. We've tried to understand this. Is this a form of third world solidarity, or is this reinforcing similar patterns? Is something else possible in the midst of the situation? So economic sanctions, of course, led by the US and the UK in particular, worsened conditions of economic decline and hyperinflation, political instability. And through all of this, the foreign direct investment of China has been growing significantly. But it's not just solidarity, it's also because of strategic recognition of the resources Zimbabwe has. So it's both political on one hand, but also it's very much in the material interests of China in terms of its corporates, because they have strategic resources, particularly lithium. So this is where Bikita comes in, because Bikita is a key area where 11 metric tons of lithium reserves exist. So that's the single largest global reserve of lithium. Zinzile, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hibist. So in our methodology, we first of all started by reviewing rare earth mineral investments in Zimbabwe. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we started by reviewing rare mineral earth minerals investments. So it wasn't that when we started our review, we straight up targeted Chinese investment. We just looked at the minerals that were there, who the key investors were, and from there we then focused on. So our focus on Zimbabwe was informed by consistent policy interventions that emphasized indigenization as it relates to the economy, and also because of the significant growth in artisanal mining. So we observed that of the investments that were there, the bulk were from Chinese entities. And from then we understood China's position in terms of its foreign investment ideas and where it wanted to go. But we also understood that China becomes the most befitting investment partner for Zimbabwe because of its non-intervention and such policies. And these policies were consistent with what Zimbabwe was trying to achieve with its indigenization, which is very different from the investment that Zimbabwe had experienced prior to the Chinese taking the fall. So our field work draws from data that was collected between 2019 and 2022 in Bikita, which is in Masvingo province of Zimbabwe. We collected our data through focus group discussions, which were held initially with 20 women. And from these 20 women, we're then able to snowball and identify 10 women for individual interviews. So when we were having these focus group discussions, they were basically based on a psychosocial healing kind of concept. We were saying these women experience different kinds of traumas, starting from the way life had changed from the time the ownership of the mine changed, and as the mine grew, the social factors and the economic factors within the Bikita area changed. So different women were affected differently. So there was a lot of trauma that we're trying to heal. What we're trying to do was to basically weave rich tapestries of women's experiences, because when we document those experiences, we're then able to give these women a voice, because they've been subjugated by society, by the patriarchal nature of extractivism, basically. So we then wanted to give them a voice and to give them a face to say, in as much as we are benefiting economically, in as much as there are social challenges, wherever there is a challenge, we know that women are disproportionately affected. So we wanted to record those stories. And in our recording those stories, we did not want to be extractivist about it also. We wanted the women to also benefit something, which was basically healing. And in their healing, they were able to then share experiences and heal each other without the interference of outsiders. Because as they shared their experiences, there was then the understanding that I am not alone. This has not just happened to me. We are a collective and we've got a voice. And together, when we speak, we can find healing. We can find a place of power, a place to say, this is what we need our development goals to look like. This is what we need investment to do for us. Yeah, so we also felt that from this platform, the women were then able to take the power back according to their own terms and their experiences and their worldviews and perspectives. So that was basically the thinking around the methodology that we used. Next slide, please.
That's amazing, Zinzile. I feel like I want to transcribe what you said, because it's absolutely beautiful and very, very transformative in its politics. So thank you so much. So just to give everyone a sense of what Bikita is about, like the people have agency in relation to things that affect them, as Zinzile showed beautifully. So in terms of the rural women, in terms of them experiencing the consequences of the climate crisis, but also building their own, if you will, their processes led by NGOs and networks like that, but really trying to create space for them to be able to reclaim their custodianship of seeds, but also in terms of knowledge production and documenting the ways in which they can now create kind of structures within which they can govern themselves as communities and protect their own human rights. And so this is basically a timeline of Bikita mine from 1910 to 2022. So all these changes in ownership and so on, but as Zinzile said, there was a decisive moment between the ownership and governance under 2015, which was actually German investors that were that were sharing ownership of this and managing the mine, and its closure and its reopening with Sinomine. So it's just since 2022, but the impact has been so significant in terms of the extractivist forms, and the things that we are seeing actually are not centrally unique to, I think that's one thing we've noticed in terms, because we've studied and worked in other contexts, other countries, and we've seen patterns. These basically reproduce those patterns in terms of the nature of extractivist development and mining operations principally. But still, there's a lot of attachment and emotion that's attached to this in terms of the impacts, and not just emotion, of course, that's part of the experience, but also in terms of inequalities reproducing. So they are deepened through all of this. So to be able to understand still how this makes such a sharp difference. And some of the things that we were able to identify is conflicts around land rights. And this relates to the fast-track land reforms that we referred to earlier, in terms of also placing limits on access to control of the land that women already face. And then also in terms of water, the water crisis that they're experiencing in an area that has increasingly becoming affected by droughts. and gender-based violence, in addition to other social problems that have arisen due to the expansion of the mine, also, as Zinzile referred to. So in terms of resettlement, just to make to get people to understand, and Zinzile, if you want to come in at any point, please let me know, just come through. The fast-track land reforms basically created a scenario where people were also relocated to other areas where they could occupy. So it wasn't just occupations of white farms, but also other areas where they could establish agriculture, livelihoods, and begin to build. But that meant that you'd have a situation of natives and migrants coming together to occupy and share increasingly scarce resources. And a situation where the lithium grade lands existed, you also have grazing areas. So people are now competing, and in the context of this extractivist project that also occurred. And then you have a situation also, arable lands now becoming less of a priority for government, and the mineral exploration being prioritized. And so women's whose ownership of land then becomes even more contested. It's already a difficult situation, but it's much, much harder in this context to be able to assert those rights. So there are multiple exclusions that women face, also as a product of social norms. And these conflicts also are marked by violence. And women are also disadvantaged by chiefs who would parcel out land that are being worked on by female-headed households. So this is a very complex and situation within which women live. So here Mavis is saying that they've had more problems than solutions in their area. They, as in Sinomine, create new rules and laws every day. And that has been hard for us to keep up with. Again, I would say that in terms of the way extractivist operations operate, this is not particularly unique in terms of them creating zones of regulation, turning themselves into like mini states and setting laws and determining who can go where and at what times and so on. Janet also adds, the coming of the Chinese has been disastrous. She says, the amount of air, land, and noise pollution has been alarming. There's plastic everywhere. So this was industrial plastic that was used to demarcate areas. And there's dust everywhere. There's blasting at all hours. So in general, they have no peace. Sinomine Resource Group, as I said earlier, they arbitrarily demarcated the area. They also impacted on their transport system. So the implication that Sinomine's operations made it much more difficult for women who are traders to bring in their goods because they've limited where the transport can get to. And by killing the transport network, now they are essentially also exposed to greater risk of sexual assault. So that makes their lives more insecure. But there's also, let's focus on the water crisis. So here Mavis again comes in and says, the challenges within the settlement as the population has gotten bigger and the allocated communal areas. This indicates that there's growth happening. And that's what extractivism, mining operations do as they increase in scale. It brings in more migrants, there's more competition, and there are too many people, too little land. So within this context, it's almost as if there's no governance happening there. There's no kind of moderating what's going on and trying to control, not in terms of migration per se, but in terms of understanding what people's needs are and planning for them. Instead, it seems that they are left in a situation that's quite chaotic. And there's massive use of water by the mine. We know that lithium mining depends a lot on water and drains that, but also there's a lot of pollution that results from that to the water systems also. So there are other implications that are not coming up as yet. Messi agrees that the water shortages have hit them really hard. Their risk, of course, she says, their risk of getting sick. So in terms of women's experiences of Bikita, Sinomine in Bikita, we've seen the different ways in which it's security, it's safety, it's the body, it's health, it's the environment. All these intermingling, but also it's in the context of how they are positioned within their societies. And it's historical, not in terms of just in the presentism that we'd like to see it. So there's also an air of impunity that exists. one can say, well, it kind of is the way these countries are governed in particular settings. So in some settings, you have rule of law, other settings, particularly Zimbabwe, because the dictatorship in place. But what we don't understand is that there is an extra layer of impunity that exists for people who are in the rural settings. And it doesn't matter if it's some sort of liberal democracy somewhere. Once you're in a rural setting, you're isolated, access to education and schooling and all of that. That we see as part of this form of organized abandonment, within which securitization is then used to regulate movement and people and the ways in which they're able to also control and regulate the state. So there's a need for devolution of powers to local communities. There's the need to protect women's land rights and secure them. But there's also a need to be able to recognize that collective rights need to also be asserted and protected. Dismantling securitization should be a key part of mineral governance strategy, but also ensuring participatory processes of decision making are absolutely necessary. Yeah, so that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for your attention.
I do have one. Then, in the meantime, this is for both of you. I was very interested when you spoke about the active disinvestment. I was wondering, so in this case, so in the case of the United States, I understand the state is favoring certain citizens compared to others. But in this case, you're saying that they're favoring those companies instead of their own citizens?
So disinvestment in the sense, yes. So you see, we're seeing disinvestment in the context of structural adjustment. And this is something that Zinzile and I were actually just discussing before we got into the space. Disinvestment in terms of trying to understand what the priority of the state was. So in the US, they talk about at the end of the Second World War, what is the consensus? What is the social compact? And what happens in the neoliberal era? Well, in our context of the post-colonial, the immediate independence period was also a period where there was an understanding that there were rights that people had, the citizens, they had to provide social infrastructure as a priority. We have to build more schools. People are demanding these things. They are asserting their citizenship. This is a new era. There's a whole high of ending this colonial period. So, but gradually you see that these countries go through crises. Zimbabwe wins its independence in the late 80s, and it's able to build a new society also. And it was an exciting time. Anytime you speak to a person from Zimbabwe, Zinzile, please correct me, but you talk about the early 80s, those were if you will, the golden years, when you see that people were actually, there was social provision as a priority. The education system was one of the best in the world. Zimbabwe continues to have a higher literacy rate than most places in the world. But what you also see is a gradual deterioration of that when structural adjustment comes in, and then it begins to erode that priority. And you also see that when Mahmoud Mamdani's work, that's why I flagged the work of Mahmoud Mamdani, because he theorizes about the way in which the peasant societies are also located within the post-colonial state. Urban areas, so this is class analysis still, urban elites are able to assert themselves in particular ways, and the state recognizes them as citizens, while that is eroded in the case of the peasants, who are treated as subjects. But it's much more complex theory than that, but in some. So it gives you a sense that the post-colonial state is a very complex entity, but it's one which is expressing particular class relations, which in agrarian literature is embedded in terms of the Black bourgeoisie wielding it for particular ends. So in the case of Zimbabwe. So I think that's how we understand the disinvestment in the context of Zimbabwe.
Yeah, just wondering whether you could just maybe talk a bit more about the idea of indigenization, and specifically what was that, and what form did it take? Because I don't know anything about it, and I'm quite interested to understand how that shaped up.
Okay, so thank you for that question. When we talk about the indigenization policy, basically what Zimbabwe did was they tried to shift ownership of resources from foreign entities to Zimbabweans. So the policy stated that every business or corporation has to have 51%, which is the controlling share belonging to a Zimbabwean national and or a Zimbabwean company, and then the 49 would then be foreign ownership. So the policy was basically, it's very good on paper, and this is one challenge that we've had as Zimbabwe, where we have these policies that are very good on paper, but then our follow through or follow up on the policies is a bit weak. So the idea was basically to give the power and control of resources back to the people and have a foreign investment being tapered to a lower percentage.
Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. I just wondered maybe about, you talk about what needs to be done going forward. I wondered what hope there is for implementing some of these changes that you say need to happen.
I think there's a lot of, we are hopeful it's going to happen because recently Sinomine went out of their way to start an initiative to drill boreholes within the community. And I think because China is also a listening and willing investor, where they're saying, let's come together, put our heads together and say, how can we improve Chinese investment? How can we improve the ways in which we're impacting the communities? How can we reduce the effects, the negatives? So I believe that when an investing nation comes forward with that mind frame, and with the Zimbabwean government also willing to engage, and us as independent scholars and different players, if we come together, we have, I personally have so much hope that this can be attainable if all the players come to the table and we look for sustainable solutions. Yeah.
Good. That's all the time we have for questions. So thanks to the audience, the online audience, and to Hibist and Zinzile for their great talk.